Good evening, Megan, Beth. Thanking you for getting me involved in this. I think I really had to dig deep into some old memories, but it was a lot of fun, a lot of tears, and a lot of laughter. So it's also good to see you, Nicola, Len, and Carrie, some of the old timers that have been around for a long time, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, but most of all, to see my family, who are new residents to Conifer, so thank you. What a wonderful evening, and it's great to be back in Vail Valley, away from the Texas heat. We gather this evening in the heart of Colorado's high country, not to just admire the beauty of these mountains, but for those in the valley who helped shape its soul and shape our family. Most of you knew them as President and Mrs. Ford, but for me, they will always be Mom and Dad. Their names echo throughout this valley, in the streets, in the gardens, in the amphitheaters. They echo in our family members. But the legacy of Gerald Ford and Betty Ford is more than names etched in public spaces. Theirs is a living, breathing story of generosity, vision, and community. So please permit me to share with you some of the memories of why this community was so special to my mom and dad. We first visited Vail in the mid-1960s, about 1968, because there was a lack of snow in Boyne Mountain, Michigan. Dad was a congressman from Michigan, as you all know. We stayed at Manor Vail, and we kids thought it was the boondocks. It was so far from town, and it was such a long walk into town. But that first visit was pretty magical for all of us. We came here to ski, but we remained for decades because of the people and the joy in this community. After that first visit, we returned every year, except for one spring break, we went to Utah. And in the early 1970s, Mom and Dad purchased a condo at the lodge, along with the Firestones. And we did a one-year stay at the Kindle house next to the Christiana. And the Kindle family, with our family, Ted Kindle, who was one of the first mayors of Vail, his dad was my dad's scoutmaster in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Another connection. So in December of 1973, our lives changed dramatically. Dad was appointed, yes, appointed, as our nation's vice president. And I knew things were going to change for Dad in a big way, especially with security. But in those days, the vice president's family did not have Secret Service. So I figured that his new agents would transition his life, but not mine. But I was sure I was in the clear. My teenage life would be totally not affected. That youthful view of my new world was abruptly shattered. The terrorists of the Symbionese Liberation Army group had a list of targets that was discovered after they kidnapped their first victim, Patty Hearst. And then there was another name on that target list, and it was Susan Ford. So within minutes, the Secret Service ordered that I immediately be given protection. And later that day, I arrived home from high school, and in an instant, my world changed. There they were, a large group of stern-looking men in suits, standing in my driveway, my new Secret Service detail. To say I was not happy is an epic understatement. But I was a junior in high school, but after a few days, my new normal with my Secret Service detail was just that, very normal. And to this day, many of my agents remain dear, dear friends of mine and my family. They know the stories that will never be told. It's called assured mutual destruction. Of course, after Dad became vice president, the question was, where would we spend Christmas in 1973? To which Dad exclaimed, Vail, of course. But our condo at the lodge was not adequate for the Secret Service. So Dick Bass kindly provided Dad and our family with the use of their home on Mill Creek Circle. So close to all the restaurants and the hangouts for us young kids, unlike Manor Vail. And he generously did so for the next 10 years. By the summer of 1974, I was an ordinary high school teenager in Alexandria, Virginia, ready to start fall classes. And then quite suddenly, on August 9th, my world was turned upside down again. With, yes, 1 day's notice, my dad got a new job. And overnight, we got a new address, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The exhilaration of moving into the White House, flying on Air Force One, state dinners, Camp David, yes, it was fantastic. But return with me now to a few weeks later to an autumn afternoon in 1974. To a small room upstairs in the White House that afternoon. My exciting life in the White House was shattered. My mom took me aside and whispered 4 words to me, I have breast cancer. And in those days, her diagnosis was grim. It was likely my mom was going to die. The unavoidable fear, and it's the kind of fear that reaches down into the pit of your stomach, was wrenching. And just because I was sitting in the White House and my mom was First Lady, it didn't make any difference. I recall my mom's conversation with my dad and me about whether to share her diagnosis and mastectomy with the public. Should she announce that she had cancer? Should anyone, much less the First Lady, dare say the word breast publicly? How much should she talk about it? Something so personal to a woman, cancer of the breast. My own first reaction was, no way. Mom ought to be able to deal with this privately with her life-threatening diagnosis. I wanted her to do what so many other women had done, simply mention that she was having so-called female problems and would undergo exploratory surgery to take care of her issue. But my mom bluntly disagreed. And at that moment, when she told me her decision, nothing was ever the same, never. There was a time when women hid breast cancer in shame and behind closed doors. And then, ladies and gentlemen, there was Betty. There was a time when the words breast and cancer would never be uttered publicly, and most certainly never by an American First Lady. And then, ladies and gentlemen, there was Betty. Instantly, the arc of women's health and the future of lives of tens of millions of women was changed forever. And in addition to that moment, marked a permanent change in the role and the public expectations of our First Ladies. 4 years later, Dad and our family had another jarring conversation with Mom. We explained to her the devastating effects of her addiction to prescription pain medications and alcohol and what they were having to do with her and our family. There was a time when conversations like ours would remain hidden in shame and secrecy. And then, ladies and gentlemen, there was Betty. There was a time when stigma of prescription and alcohol addiction was as cynical as it was cruel. Most often, it was confused incorrectly with individual moral failure, and failure caused solely by personal choice. And then, ladies and gentlemen, there was Betty. Mom refused to hide in the usual dark corners of secrecy and shame. Instead, she went to the public, and oh, do I mean public. She demonstrated by word and deed that in seeking treatment with some might mistake for personal weakness is in truth the hopeful pathway to renewal. But Mom didn't stop with her public announcement. She and Ambassador Leonard Firestone created the Betty Ford Center, a treatment facility that 4 decades later is still recognized in the globe as the gold standard for treatment of those suffering from substance use disorder, but most importantly, for their families and children. So let us go back to the autumn of 1974. Mom's breast cancer surgery was difficult. Her recovery was estimated to take several months. And of course, Dad being president and Mom being the first lady, there was this big thing always hanging over us: the White House schedule. Well, the White House schedule people had a pressing question. And it was even more pressing because Mom's need to heal for her surgery. Then what should we plan for the first family's Christmas? So the whispers began of what to do, and who should they ask? Mom was aware of the whispers, and for those of you who knew my mom, you know what happened. Oh my. Mom swiftly and bluntly told the White House staff, "You don't have to ask the president. You don't have to ask me. We're going to Vail for Christmas. Count on it. No questions asked." Dad loved Vail. We all loved Vail. We loved the people. We loved the village. And yes, he loved to ski. A little-known secret, though, is that the Secret Service had to search throughout the entire agency for the agents who were the best skiers. And the only ones who could keep up with Dad, whizzing down not quite black diamonds. Right, Brez? But Peppy was always leading the way. And it wasn't just Dad and our family who enjoyed coming here for Christmas. Tom Brokaw was White House correspondent for NBC News in those days. And 4 decades later, Dad asked Tom to deliver a eulogy at Dad's state funeral. Yes, think about that for a moment. A president asking a former member of the White House press corps to deliver one of his eulogies? And during that eulogy, Tom reflected on Dad's visits to Vail. Quote, "For the past year, we have been hearing the familiar lyrics of the hymns to the passing of famous man. The hosannas in his decency, his honesty, his modesty, his steady as she goes qualities. It's what we've come to expect on these occasions, but this time there was extra value. For in the case of Gerald Ford, the lyrics have the added virtue of being true. And as journalist, I was especially grateful for his appreciation of our role, even when we challenged his policy and taxed his patience with our constant presence and perseverance. To be a member of the Gerald Ford White House press corps brought other benefits as well. There were advantages that we didn't advertise quite as widely. We went to Vail for Christmas with our families. Now, cynics might argue that contributed to our affection for him, but that's not a premise that I wish to challenge," end quote. So when Dad became president in 1974, and for the next 4 decades, Vail found itself on national and international stage. The press corps dubbed it the Rocky Mountain White House. Images of the U.S. president skiing down Vail slopes were broadcast into living rooms across America and the world. But also, thanks to the Vail Trail, before it was the Vail Daily, there was paparazzi following us all over town. There was no sneaking into Donovan's, the Slope, or Los Amigos. Unfortunately, Dad lost the election in 1976, But fortunately, we decided to spend the entire next summer here in Vail. Maybe one of my most favorite summers. Because I really didn't have Secret Service agents anymore. I was free, and my parents felt safe with me wandering around with friends. But the chief of police was determined to catch me underage drinking in Garton's Casino, in the Sundance Saloon, and Donovan's. And after that, in 1977, it was repeated every year for almost 30 years. Dad didn't just bring visibility to Vail. He invited dignitaries, cabinet members, global leaders to the Valley. These weren't just names in history books. They were guests in Vail restaurants, participants in community forums, and friendly faces on the streets of Vail. The first summer after we left the White House, Dad started the Gerald Ford Invitational Golf Tournament. It was a 3-day event with PGA golfers like Jack Nicklaus and celebrities like Jackie Gleason and leaders from the government, business, and the entertainment world. The tournament became a shining beacon for participants of tens of thousands of other visitors who came to Vail for the tournament and the joys of this community. The early years of the tournament were the best. It was such a community event. Everybody in town volunteered. And most importantly for Dad, the tournament over the years raised tens of millions of dollars for the Vail Valley Foundation, which Dad helped found, and the Eagle River Scholarship Fund. And of course, let's remember that once Dad and the others started the Vail Valley Foundation, they never lost sight of the mission. They made certain that the foundation brought the World Alpine Ski Championships, the World Mountain Bike Championships, and countless cultural and educational events to Vail. Dad established the AEI Forum, a powerful annual gathering of international leaders in Vail Valley to discuss global policies, financial and security issues. I know, perhaps it's hard to imagine today. There was a time when world leaders would assemble here in Vail every summer to seek solutions to the most pressing security, economic, health, and yes, environmental challenges around the globe. Every night of those weeks, the network news anchors would open their broadcasts with a simple introduction. We now take you to Vail, Colorado, for the news of the day. But I'll let you in on a little secret. All was not fancy and protocol and precision during AEI, World Forum Week. And one year, she's going to shoot me, my youngest daughter, Heather, was privileged to be living here in Vail with my mom and dad while she worked as a teenager at the stables for the summer. And late one afternoon, she arrived back at Beaver Creek, and Mom told her to quickly go up and take a shower because she was covered in horse manure and dust, and put on some nice clothes because Andrea Mitchell and her husband, Alan Greenspan, would be joining Mother and Dad and Heather at a private dinner that they were hosting for Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. Heather turned to her grandmother and said, I would love to have a nice dinner with Andrea and her husband. But she asked, who's Chancellor Helmut Schmidt guy? My mother gently hid her surprise at the generation gap question and explained to Heather that Helmut Schmidt was the former German chancellor and was one of the most transformative, inspirational leaders of post-war Europe. Heather sheepishly smiled and headed up to the loft to get cleaned up for dinner. And of course, to Dad, Vail was not all policy and world leaders. Let's remember Dad's boundless enthusiasm for the Ford Amphitheater. He was so proud to have his name associated with a place that the dance festival, the 4th of July concerts, and the culture bringing the arts to this beautiful valley and to the residents and the visitors. And finally, let's pause and remember the Beaver Creek Interfaith Chapel. When the idea for a place of worship in Beaver Creek was first proposed to Dad, there was no hesitation. He was all in because he didn't want to drive all the way to Vail for Christmas Eve service. Vail Associates provided the land, and Dad and his dear friend Leonard Firestone set about to raise the necessary funds. For example, Dad would host a benefit breakfast at McCoy's in Village Hall during the Men's World Cup races for just $15 a person. And as a result, Len's and Dad's efforts, as they are saying, the rest was history. If Dad brought the world to Vail, Mom brought her heart to the valley. My mother was a dancer, a mother, a grandmother, a first lady, and a trailblazer. Her openness about breast cancer and addiction changed our national conversation. As one historian summarized, when one examines the history of women's health in America, it's divided into two very distinct periods, before Betty and after Betty. But Mom's impact here in Vail was just as profound. In 1988, the Betty Ford Alpine Gardens was named in her honor. Those gardens, which are the highest elevation botanical gardens in North America, reflect her love of nature and healing. She was very passionate about the Vail Breast Cancer Awareness Group. She lent her voice and her time to countless local charities and was deeply involved in the community for nearly 3 decades. When I say Mom was involved in the community, I don't mean as simply as fundraising events and special causes. My children thought every kid got to light the Christmas trees and have sleigh rides with Santa Claus. The valley was magical for them also. Riding on the fire truck in the 4th of July parades and watching the fireworks in Beaver Creek. But some of you may remember when the first Walmart opened just down at the base of Beaver Creek. But what you may not know was that it was a favorite customer many years was Betty Ford. It didn't matter what item Mom or Dad thought that they needed. Mom's answer was always at the ready. "Oh, don't worry, Jerry. I'll just run down to Walmart and pick up 2 or 3 of them." And sure enough, off to Walmart she would go, she and her Secret Service detail. And when they arrived, there was always a cascade of, "Hi, Betty. Hey, Betty, you should look at the new plants that just arrived. Betty, those night lights that you ordered are over on aisle 6. And not surprisingly, the Vail Valley News began to refer the store as Betty's Mart. Nevertheless, in spite of their global lives, Mom and Dad were regulars at local restaurants, participants in community events, supporters of local charities. They turned on the Vail Christmas tree lights each year. They judged the 4th of July parades from Pepe and Shika's balcony. They loved watching the precision lawn chairs, spectacular performance every year. In short, Vail was home to them, and home to them in every way. As Rod Slifer, Vail's extraordinary former mayor, once said, "If you stand back and look at Vail and its remarkable history, President Ford and Betty Ford had a lasting impact on this community like no other." Mom and Dad didn't just visit Vail, they were a part of it. They didn't just admire the mountains, they helped build the valley and what it is. So in closing, permit me to recall a story that's never been shared publicly. It's a story that captures an image that is more powerful than words. I could speak much about how Dad and Mom loved this community, but in August of 2006, Dad spent his last birthday in Beaver Creek. Dad was flown from here to Mayo Clinic, where he planned to undergo open heart valve replacement surgery. And unknown publicly at the time, Mom was also suddenly admitted into Mayo for a serious blood clot condition. Mom's condition was successfully treated. My dad was unable to have the surgery. The day came for them to leave the hospital after 2 weeks. But first, the doctors and I had to have a difficult conversation with them. But because of their declining medical conditions, what they thought was going to be a quick flight back to Vail was not going to happen. The news was blunt. President and Mrs. Ford, you will not be returning to Colorado today. You will not return to Colorado ever again. Never. Instead of a cascade of questions and pushback, there was a silence. Dad and Mom sat quietly, holding one another's hand. And finally, a big tear began to flow down his cheek. And the tears spoke volumes about the boundless love that they had for this community. And he turned to Dr. Miller and said simply, "It's such a special place, as you know." The story of Dad and Mom and Vail reminds us that being a part of a community isn't just about titles and celebrities. It's about showing up. It's about giving back. It's about believing in the magic of a place. The legacy of Gerald Ford and Betty Ford shines brightly in this valley. Their footprints are in the snows. Their roots are in the gardens. And their spirit is in the heart. That may spirit be a source of joy and happiness, and all who come to these glorious mountains. Thank you. Mr. Lynn. Only the stories we're allowed to tell.
Well, couple things. First thing that comes to mind, Susan, is that was extraordinary.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And secondly, I would say it's so great to see you. And my sister, Carrie Firestone Romer's here, who I'm sure is feeling the same things, many of the same things I am, of all the memories that have been conjured up. And thank you for that. I did not think this would be an emotional kind of discussion, but they're just extraordinary memories. And so I would just say that I'm honored to be here and be here with you representing our family, because the Ford family touched so many people in our family, and I'm just fortunate to be here to talk about some of those things, and fortunate to be able to talk about them as a proud member of this community, as is my sister and her husband, Tim Romer, who are in Eagle Vale, and my wife, Nicole, and I and our kids are in Avon, and we've been there for a number of years as well. So, The third thing I would mention, looking at my children, is like you, looking at your grandchildren and your daughter, that it's so extraordinary to be able to share this and have them have the opportunity to hear from you and, the stories that I'll share, and I think Carrie will as well, of the relevance and impact this community has had on our lives. And more specifically, your family has had on our lives, which we are so grateful for. So we're looking forward to talking about some of those things. But I would say, I asked Susan at the start of this, what kind of programming are we doing here? And she said, well, I think it might be a little loose, but just share some stories. And, there's a whole bunch. And you reminded me of several things. And one being, I think you said 1976 as your first summer in the Valley here, but maybe by yourself.
Yeah.
So 10 years later, I was in the Valley for the first summer of my life, and somehow convinced my parents, this was great, I just graduated from high school, somehow convinced my parents that I could spend the summer in Vail working on the Ford golf tournament, the Celebrity Pro-Am, and that my grandfather was 10 miles away and I could live in Vail, that everything would be okay and I would not get into any trouble. I didn't get into any trouble that anyone could actually identify, but I had a lot of fun here. It was
Me
fantastic.
too.
But it was a thrill. It was a thrill to be invited to work on the golf tournament. And, probably one of the funniest stories or interesting stories that came out of that, Susan mentioned what an impactful tournament that was in Vail. And one of the entertainers that everyone looked forward to seeing was Bob Hope,
Yep.
who was here, I think, just about every year.
Almost every year, yeah.
And of course, extraordinary entertainer. So he stayed at my grandfather's house. And so in the last 5 years of the tournament, which finished, I think, after what, a 20,
It went
25
20 years, yeah.
20 years, the last 5 years of the tournament, my grandfather just wasn't up for playing any longer. And so I was able to take his spot in the tournament, which was wonderful for a number of reasons. One, it was time that was extraordinary with him because no one else was at the house really. And that period, helped develop our relationship because I was about 25 at the time. We played a lot of golf and we just had a lot of fun together doing that. And in the evenings of the tournament, typically Bob and Dolores were staying at his house. Your parents would come over to my grandfather's house, and there was...
Because their houses were next door to each other.
Yes, right next door to each other in Beaver Creek and also...
In Palm Springs.
In Palm Springs and Rancho Mirage. And it was just, there was a number of stories, but there was one evening where we were sitting around the dinner table and Bob Hope started telling stories. And it was so, and your parents, I think, were over at that time as well. So here I'm 25 years old. Here's the former president of the United States, my grandfather, who was, iconic in my mind, in our minds, and Bob Hope. And one night he started telling stories about himself and Jack Benny in Scotland in a castle, drinking, of course, probably too much, but putting on the suits of armor that were in the castle and running around playing like, they were, in medieval times. And it was hilarious and just so memorable. We mentioned Palm Desert. So the relationship goes back so far. So for those of you, you heard Susan say that Ambassador Firestone. So of course, the president, President Ford, nominated my grandfather to be ambassador of Belgium, which he was approved, and so he enjoyed that. And just, another extraordinary memory for our family was, because of that, we got to go to Belgium and visit with him and see him in the residence there, and begin to understand what being an ambassador was, because we were pretty young. But incredible memories there. So they were great friends, as Susan's talked about. So neighbors in Rancho Mirage, and neighbors here, of course, but a very distinct memory. There was something else you mentioned in your speech that made me recall an encounter with the Secret Service. So we were all pretty young, running around Palm Springs, and the thing that I remember was, this was just a couple years ago. I met one of the former Secret Service agents at Eagle Springs, at the golf course there. And he got to explaining to me that he was on the president's detail in Palm Desert through the 70s. And I said, gosh, we spent a lot of time out there with our grandfather and saw the Fords a lot. I said, we were pretty young at one point, and do you remember like a group of 5 children maybe jumping over the fence and running through the yard? And he looked at me and he said, do you remember the machine gun? And I was like, oh my God, this is the guy. He was like, I remember you. It was unbelievable. But, so I'm just kind of sharing all these different things that, were so impactful and meaningful. And so they're the fun, social kinds of things that I'm talking about, and young children experience. And then things, moved on, where, I was on the Chairman's Council of the Betty Ford Center. My sister was on the board of the Alpine Gardens. And, meaningful things as we got older, that we continued the relationship, that brought, significance in another way to that, to the relationship and friendship.
Well, we were like the first houses in Beaver Creek.
Yeah.
There was nothing over here.
Yeah, that's right.
And I remember when I was pregnant with this one, which was 40-some years ago, we all said to my dad, why? Why are we going to Beaver Creek? There's nothing over there. There's no restaurants, there's no town, and there was barely much of anything.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's certainly developed.
But we still found a way to have fun.
Yes, we did. We played Pictionary at our house.
So I mentioned the being on the Chairman's Council of the Betty Ford Center. So you may not know this story, but we were up for one of the annual meetings in Vail. Yeah, of course, you were there, of course, as chairman. It was the night before I was going to propose to Nicole. So we're having dinner, and I'm sitting next to your parents, and there's 2 stories here that are funny, but so I'm sitting next to them, and I explained to them that we were here for the conference for the center, but the next day my plan was to propose to Nicole up on Vail Mountain, looking over Holy Cross. Ooh. And I said, so the ruse that I need to develop here, so she doesn't figure out what is the plan, is that we're going to have dinner with the Fords in Vail. And I'm telling, kind of explaining this to your parents. And I said, are you okay with this? And I said, so a car was going to pick up Nicole, bring her to Vail, and then I had arranged for her to get up the mountain. And, I'd been, of course, thinking about it and planning for it, and it's marriage, right? And so your mom was like, we're all in. We're all in. What do you need us to tell her? To distract her or make it more believable, whatever. And they were the only ones that knew the plan. The only ones that knew the plan. That same dinner, we're getting served dessert. And the waiter gets to your dad and he explains what the dessert is. And the president says, yeah, I'd like one of those. And the waiter says, sir, there's a great deal of sugar in there. And he said, I'm 90. He's like, it's okay. It's all right. It was unbelievable. It was so great.
He liked his desserts.
Yeah, oh yeah. So, just a few, hopefully interesting stories and somewhat emotional for us. And it's just wonderful to share and wonderful to have the time to reminisce on this in this manner.
Because what year did you all come to Vail?
It would have been 68 was the first
So you were
year.
there, your first year was our first year?
Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't realize that.
And then...
But that's when we were all at the lodge.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then,
Yeah.
of course, I think the first time we spent any time with your family was probably around 71, right before, he moved to the vice presidency, right? And we enjoyed a Rose Bowl in your condominium there. It must have been Ohio State, Michigan, I'm guessing.
It all depends who wins.
Oh, it was USC. USC. Okay. Well, I know, where's James? I think James was maybe going to open things up to
Well, and I
questions.
would love to hear people who knew my parents tell stories about their interactions with them. Because there are stories that Len and I don't know. I mean, I know Carrie has a good story to tell, and Bill Bresnahan, who was one of the lucky Secret Service agents to chase all of us down the mountain, shall we say.
Well, in probably 1974, the Secret Service found out that the Ford family was going to come to Vail to ski and for Christmas. The Secret Service hadn't skied, I don't think, since the Kennedy administration. So they didn't have any skiers. So they put out, in those days, a teletype that said, "Who knows how to ski?" And I raised my hand and thought I knew how to ski. And I had learned to ski in the Washington, D.C. area, so anybody that knows D.C. knows we don't have any mountains. We don't hardly have any hills. So we came out here, and they gave us about a week ahead of time, and Bill Brown took one look at us and said, "You guys are in trouble." And he said, "First of all, you don't ski on my mountain in blue jeans." Okay, so we all had blue jeans, and he took care of getting us some ski clothes. More importantly, he said, "You don't ski on my mountain skiing as bad as you guys are." So we went through a week of 8 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon of boot camp, Bill Brown style, learning to ski. We got a little better. So the story I have is about the second day, that first Christmas, President Ford was skiing, and we had enough agents out here. We had to assign one to Susan and one to each of her brothers. And luckily, I got Susan, and we assigned also a ski patroller to each one of them. And Brian McCartney was the ski patroller that was working with me. And so we go up the mountain. This is embarrassing to me, but not to Susan. We go up the mountain, and Brian and Susan take off, and I'm hoping they're going down Swingsville. No, right into the back bowls. And so I take off into the back bowls and have a yard sale like you wouldn't believe. Skis are going everywhere, gloves, goggles, everything was gone. And Susan and Brian were gone. And I'm going, this is the end of my job. I've got one agent with Susan, and now there's no agents with Susan. So anyway, we go, and I clean up. I'm searching for my skis, so you people that have skied the back bowls, which I don't go back to ever again, find that the skis take off on you. Mine took off, and they were gone. And I finally found them, got them on. I do not remember to this day how I got down the rest of the mountain, because I blew up in the first 30 feet. And so I got down to the bottom, and I said, what am I going to do? And at that time, we only had chair 5. So I got over to chair 5, and I said, I'll never find them. And I got to the top, and Susan and Brian had waited for me at the top. So it kind of saved my job, probably. So, but we had a great time. Susan had a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun. And like Susan and her family, my family have been here ever since. Thanks for coming back. Great stories.
And I should have mentioned, in the balcony, you can ask questions too. We'll scamper up there, so feel free to raise your hand. Are there other questions? Yeah, we've got one here.
Carrie's got a good story too.
Yes, I'm Eleanor Cisneros, and I'm speaking for my husband. Anyway, I have to tell you that George skied with President Gerald Ford, and he was Chico, and they called him the man.
Yeah.
Chico and the man, so this is Chico. And he had some wonderful stories to tell about, and we have pictures at home that your dad signed for him saying, you know, thank you for your service, and all the elk lunches that they had at the top. And I have to say, it was quite an honor, because my family couldn't believe that my husband was skiing with Gerald Ford. And I come from the poorest county of Colorado, which is Conejos County, and they had pictures of Gerald Ford and my husband all over the bar. My Uncle Eddie used to own a bar. So they had pictures of him and President Ford, just because they were so proud that we were able to participate and even be involved with that a little bit.
No, those elk lunches, Ski Patrol elk lunches, were amazing. So thank you very, very much. They were delicious.
Okay, sorry. My name is George Cisneros, and I'm not quite the speaker that my wife is, but anyway, yeah, it was quite a privilege skiing with Gerald Ford. I was just a local boy that grew up right around the corner in Minturn, and I always wanted to be on the ski patrol ever since I saw my first skier at Cooper Hill, and I said, that's what I want to do. Then I found out that they paid to be on ski patrol, and I thought, I have to be one of these guys. So I did get to meet Don Almond, who was a mountain manager of Vail, and Bill Brown was, I think, I'm not sure what Almond's position was. I think he was like the president, but anyway, he says, I think I can get you a job. Why don't you go and talk to Bill Brown this evening? Because I was on the police reserve with Donald Almond. But anyway, so I go in, and there comes this guy that looks like John Wayne in his yellow fatigues. He'd been up on the mountain, he's full of mud, and that was back in 1968 when they were still cutting a lot of the trails. Yeah. And Bill Brown comes up like John Wayne and says, what's your name? And it says, George. And I'm pretty meek, and he says, so you want a ski patrol job? I says, yeah, I would. He says, can you ski? I says, yeah, I can ski. And he says, but can you really ski? And I says, well, I believe I can. He says, show up tomorrow, and we'll give you a job on the Vail trail crew. And so I did that for a couple of months, and in January, someone quit. And I got the call, and they said, go up to report to Ski Patrol, you're now on Ski Patrol. And because I had been a ski patroller at Meadow Mountain on the volunteer patrol. So a few years later, I think it was 1974 when Gerald Ford first became president, Paul Tesweed comes up to me one day and says, "You're going to be on the Ford detail." And I says, "Oh, really?" I says, "Well, that's great. I'd love to do that." So Chuba Nelson and myself were appointed to be on his detail and watch all these other Secret Service guys ski and help them out as best we could. I remember Dave Beeler and Bill Bresingham, I remember quite well, the people that I worked with. And so we did that for a couple of years. President Ford was probably one of the best people that I ever met. I had lunch with him numerous times. He would always ask, when are we having that caribou feed, he'd said. And then the guys, they knew what it was. It was actually elk. But he says, "I'm looking forward to that caribou feed up at Ski Patrols." The Ski Patrol HUD, so we would go up there. And I think it was one of the last years that I skied with him. We're going down a catwalk from the top of chair 6 to down towards 10. And I skied right behind him. I was called the human blanket. And the Secret Service pretty much had to get a commitment from him in the event that there'd been an assassination attempt on Gerald Ford's life. So I was asked that if I was going to ski with him, that I needed to be the human blanket, and if he took fire, I was to lay on top of him and protect him. Anyway, one day we're skiing down this catwalk, and it was the very first run, and Gerald Ford really hadn't got his ski legs under him yet. And next thing I know, he just drops right over in the middle of the catwalk, and he just lays there. And someone says, "Ski Patrol up." And it was like Medic up or something, and I go up and I check him out, and he was kind of stunned for a while. And then he had some blood on his forehead. And I saw this little scratch here, and I took all my gear and did my thing, put a Band-Aid on him. I sat him up and told him, "I think you're going to be okay." And yeah, he got up and he was on his way again. But anyway, it was quite an experience for me, and to be able to have such an honor from just the local Mexican kid around the corner to be able to work on the Vail Ski Patrol. And even more than that, to be able to have the honor of skiing with the President of the United States and seeing yourself on TV every night. So anyway, I really appreciate saying a few words about this, and it's been quite an honor working with your dad.
Thanks.
I'm Carrie Romer, Leonard's sister, and I just wanted to say a few things too. As you've heard, our families were friends, and we were friends in Washington and when we came out here. In fact, Susan and I both went to the Holton Arms School, and I very well remember the Secret Service in the hallway because that was so cool. But I was in middle school and she was in upper school, so it was fun to witness that in the school halls. When I think of our time with the Ford family, it was at the lodge a lot when we were young, and it was kind of crazy because one year first of all, Michigan and USC kept playing each other in the Rose Bowl, and so the Rose Bowl we always went to watch at the Ford's condo on the 3rd floor, and we were on the 5th floor. And one year he was congressman, the next year he was the vice president, and the next year he was the president. It was like, wow, I'm 10 years old, and I'm thinking, wow, does this happen? This is so interesting. And of course, the president was the president, and we were in awe of him. Mrs. Ford was just so strong, as Susan has described, but so gentle. I mean, that makes me cry, because I think there was one of those parties where Chris, our brother, was literally throwing up, and it was Betty who took care of him in the bathroom. And I remember that. It's kind of strange. But anyway, we had beautiful memories with them there. And then fast forward to the next decade, I got to fall in love with somebody who was from Denver, so I've continued coming up here for many reasons. And I would bring Tim up, of course, in the 80s, and there was an incident once on Elk Track Court because the president had his pool in the indoor pool in the back for him to do his laps, and we were all at my grandfather's, my siblings, cousins, I don't know, it was a whole crew. Tim was there. And we thought it would be so fun to just go swim, and that was the coolest thing. We just, went right over, and we were all over the water, in, out. I don't even know how many of us there were.
Yes, and there may have been some Coors spread around.
Oh, yeah, maybe that too.
We were all in like college age at this point.
Yeah. And all of a sudden, the door opens, and in comes President Ford with his towel. We were like, uh-oh. Everybody out.
He was, it's probably the only time a president has ever moonwalked. He was like out of there. And we were like, it was like he gave an order to scramble the jets because we just got our stuff together. We're out. It was unbelievable.
Very similar, very similar. Anyway, by our relationship early on, and then our grandfather with President Ford in Colorado and California has been a really big part of our life and incredible, and I'm so happy we're all friends.
Yeah.
And still coming here, most importantly. It's an incredible place. And more families going to be coming here too. Thank you.
Okay. We're coming to the back of the room.
I hear Frampton. I had a great story that I think really epitomizes Betty. It was 1981, and I moved here to become president of Vail Associates at the time. And about a week after I was here, I had to host the first homeowners association meeting in Beaver Creek, and there were 75, 80 people in the back in that room. John Horn Cates was there. I will never forget it. And sitting out in the audience amongst 75 people were Betty and Gerald Ford. And we went through all the things you go through in those kind of meetings. And at the time, Vail Associates ran the TV company. We owned it. We were effectively Comcast. And Betty raised her hand, because I'd never met her, but raised her hand from the back and said that they had a problem. That the cable service, I think, cost $15 a month. However, in their house, they had 15 or 20 televisions. And she asked for a discount. And guess what we did? We gave it to her.
Yeah, he was tight as a tick.
Hello. This is a story about a different part of the gracious man that Gerald Ford was. It was, I think, October of 1973, when Spiro Agnew had resigned under pressure from the vice presidency, and on a Thursday, I think in October, the Nixon White House announced that they would name, that the president, when in the East Room the next night, Friday night, announced the name of his successor. I was a young producer with ABC News, and ABC sent teams out all over the country to do profiles on all the men, and there were only men, who were on the short list. One name that was not on the short list was Michigan's Gerald Ford. Nobody thought Gerald Ford was going to get the nod. That was on a Thursday, so ABC sent these teams out all over the country. On Friday morning, I walked into our bureau, I was based in Chicago, to edit a piece for that night's network newscast, and the phone rang, and it was ABC in New York saying, you got to charter a plane, get a camera crew, get to Grand Rapids. Our congressional correspondent said, it's going to be Ford. Everybody else had written him off, but they decided to humor this guy. So we got up to Grand Rapids, we had some success. I think we went to your family paint store.
No, that had been, well, you could have. My uncle was running it at that time.
Your uncle was running it. So we interviewed him. He gave us some nuggets. We interviewed one of your father's elementary school teachers, believe it or not. She claimed to remember everything he had ever done. And we got a few other nuggets. We rushed back to Chicago. We edited the piece. I was expecting to go home empty-handed because it was not going to be Gerald Ford, but all of a sudden, with the TV monitor on in the editing room, his Ford was mentioned by Richard Nixon as the next vice president of the United States. And after I changed my pants, I was a producer, I'd never been on television, We rushed into the projection room. It was a primetime special. All the networks, of course, had gone to cover the East Room announcement. And Howard K. Smith was our anchorman. And after the name Ford was uttered, he said, "And so who is this man who's just a heartbeat from the presidency?" Here's ABC's Greg Dobbs. And I did my piece, and it was about a 7 or 8 minute piece. And despite myself, it was a success. ABC asked me to be a correspondent. And that's how I spent most of my life. Fast forward to maybe 20 some years ago, my wife and I are at a Bravo concert, and the president is sitting just across the aisle and a couple of rows down. And at intermission, you've probably seen him do this many times, people lined up to shake his hand. But of course, as any good president learns to do, he would say, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." He would move them along, and I said to Carol, "I'm going to make him stop." So I got in line, and when I got up to him, I said to him very quickly, "Mr. President, I owe my career to you." He's passing me along. He said, "What?" And in 2 sentences, fewer than I'm telling you tonight, I told him the story, and the man had the class to say to me, "You made my day." And I've never forgotten it.
We have something to share from online, and I will read it verbatim. This is from Alicia Dunn. "I had the pleasure of meeting President and Mrs. Ford on several occasions. I worked at Vail Valley Medical Center as a registered nurse from 1983 to 2012. I remember meeting Mrs. Ford at many lunches and fundraisers as she supported breast cancer testing. Thanks to Mrs. Ford, VVMC had the first mammogram testing unit in the Rocky Mountains outside of Denver." Another one that will end in a question for you. From Kat, "A highlight for Steve Haber was a big salmon bake he personally did for the Vail Valley Foundation. Those were wonderful years, kind, respectful, joyous. What is a story about your mom and dad that reveals how much they loved each other?"
Well, I think the thing that sticks in my mind, because when my dad chose to run for presidency, my mother was convinced when he was a congressman that he was going to finish his 26 years in the House, and he was going to go be a professor at the University of Michigan, or go hang out with the Firestones out in Carmel, who had a lovely home out there. But he, that was not on the agenda, as we all know. He became vice president, which is not a job he ever wanted. And as he told Dick Cheney, vice presidents don't do anything. The only job he ever wanted and never got was Speaker of the House. And in his days in Congress, the Republicans didn't have the majority, so he got to be minority leader, but he never got to be Speaker of the House. So when he made the decision, or I would say they made the decision, because you didn't make decisions without consulting my mother, she said, okay, but she was not all in, because she really wanted a quiet lifestyle. And so I think when you look at how she supported him through all the years as a congressman's wife, she raised 4 kids pretty much by herself. He wasn't home that much because he was traveling. And he wasn't just traveling to Michigan, he was traveling to districts all over the country, because when you're minority leader, you're out helping other people get elected in their districts. So my dad was on the road probably 200 to 250 nights a year. So in a sense, I was very glad when he lost the election, because I wanted my dad home. Now, granted, I was, much older then, but it was like I wanted them to have their time. And that's really what Vail, they loved coming up here. And it was a true love story. but also his support of her when she went for treatment for her substance use disorder. You know, that breaks up a lot of marriages, and he was there for her as they went through health issues throughout their life. They supported each other. When he had his knee replacement surgery, we all stayed away because it was not pleasant. He was not a good patient, and you know, once he had his knees replaced, back then, you weren't allowed to ski again. And the doctors basically told him, do you want to ski or do you want to play golf? And he said, I guess I'll play golf. So his joy in life after he gave up skiing was taking his grandchildren down to ski school every morning. And I'd say, Dad, I'll take them. Nope, nope, nope. That's my job. I got to have a purpose. And he would get up and he would take them down and he would pick them up at the end of the day. And you know, but he continued to play golf for a long time. Both he and Leonard did.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think the support of each other in their trials, but also in the good days. They had a great marriage that they supported each other incredibly.
I'll just stand in place. I'll try to be quick. But just it's fun to hear, and I think, Susan, what you said about community and connectivity in the small world. So a couple small world things real quick. A good friend of Carrie and mine lives in California. He used to be a professional golfer, and he won the Vail tournament in 1985. He did complain about some young kid who really wasn't doing his job on the side of the course.
Probably Lance.
And he kind of remembered maybe it was a Firestone, but I didn't go there. But as the defending champion, he played the next year with your father every year.
That's right.
And Mark said, I can't do that because I have to be in Memphis at 5:30 the next day to go right at the end of the tournament. And your dad says, I'll take care of it. And so he flew him to Memphis. So it just shows how I think big-hearted your dad was. I think to me it really struck when you talk about community and your dad's focus on Vail. And it overlapped a lot with my dad. My dad was governor from 86 to 98. And his whole focus on Colorado was you got to focus on the environment because it's the beauty of Colorado. You got to focus on education, and you got to focus on workers and jobs. And I think that overlaps a lot with your dad. Sorry, I'm getting emotional too. But they're both great men. So to share it. So the last funny story, Chancellor Smith, I think, was here because of the G7 event, which was in Denver, which my dad hosted. And this will connect to your mom. Okay. And my dad wanted to spruce up the governor's mansion. He had all these leaders coming in. And so he rented rugs to make the mansion look better. Chancellor Smith came in and was rubbing his feet on the rugs. And he looked at him and said, shh, shh, please don't do that. They're rented. So it went around. So all G7 people in the world knew that my dad had rented the rugs. So I think it kind of fits with your mom, potentially, that they were both very frugal and very thoughtful. So I'll show.
I'm Nicola, and I'm the director of Betty Ford Alpine Gardens. So it goes without saying that we are incredibly grateful, particularly to Betty Ford. But we got to know both of them very well when the gardens were named for Betty Ford, because we felt that so many things had been named for President Ford that it was time that something was named for Betty. And they became very, very active in the gardens, not just attending all of our fundraising events, but coming to strategic planning sessions. And it was just a real privilege to see how much she cared about it and how involved she became. But one just little story. It was a very quiet day in the afternoon, and I was working in the garden. I had my baby with me, and I had her in a stroller pushed up against one of the benches in the garden. And the next thing, a voice says, "Hey, do you mind if we sit at this bench?" And I looked over, and it was President and Betty Ford. So, of course, I ran over, and I said, "Of course, let me move the stroller." And by this time, Betty Ford was Googling with my daughter in the stroller, who was only a few months old. And she said, "You know what, Nicola?" She said, "Have you got some errands to run? Because we'd be very happy to just watch the baby for a while." And so I tell my daughter that Betty was her first babysitter. So.
I'll bet you my daughter Heather has a story.
Strong encouragement from the little one.
Well, it will be shocking to know that my daughter is named Betty, and she is the one telling me what to do. So, I every time after having my daughter, and every time she's a handful, I can just feel my grandmother looking over at me and saying, "What do you expect?" Sorry, baby. So I had the joys of, after my freshman and sophomore years in high school, living up here in Vail and actually living with my grandparents in Beaver Creek, and working for Steve Jones at Beaver Creek Stables. So I was working at a dude ranch with 60 horses, and it was the best job I've ever had, now at almost 43 years old. And going back to the question that was asked online, about a picture of how they were in love. And, you know, I was lucky enough to know my grandparents long after he was president. So I got to see their love firsthand, which was one of the greatest gifts I've been ever given. But every time she would come down for dinner, he would say, he would say, "Can you look at my beautiful bride?" I mean, they were in their 90s, and she would probably come down in a bathrobe. Honestly, she loved her bathrobes. But he would say, "Just look at my beautiful bride." And they would sit at dinner in their 80s and 90s holding hands. And it was just an incredible love story. I would say a funny story. I was probably 10. I'm not going to tell the story that you want me to tell. I'm going to tell a different story. And not incriminate myself, because my husband and children are here. So there was a situation where President Bush and Dan Quayle were running for office, and Dan Quayle had come through Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so it was in June, and so we were going to DC for the annual Ford Foundation event in DC. And of course, I knew who Dan Quayle was, because it was a big deal. He was the vice president, and I was very excited. And all of a sudden, my parents were like, "Okay, instead of taking a commercial flight to Washington, we're gonna fly on Air Force Two." Can you imagine? Okay, I'm 10 years old. I know who my grandparents are, but I don't really know who they are at 10 years old. So we fly to DC, and I fly in Air Force Two, and I'm so excited. And so we're going to go see Grandma and Grandpa at the Willard Hotel. And I run in, and I'm like, "Grandpa, you will never believe who I just met. I just met Dan Quayle, and I rode on Air Force Two." And he goes, "What am I, chopped liver?" But that is truly, I thought they were I thought everybody's grandparents turned on lights at Christmas, and I thought everybody had secrets there. I really had no clue, because I had very little context for what was happening. And so, yeah, they were just Grandma and Grandpa. And we were always so grateful for our time up here, and the fact that everybody was so kind and loving, but also we were able to go to the Beaver Creek ice skating rink and ice skate on Christmas, and nobody would bother us. We would just be a family, and everybody would be so kind and respectful. And it's really just such a magical place for our family. And now I've just moved my family to Colorado because of my wonderful memories here. So.
Does that work?
Yes.
Okay. Susan, I know you remember Brian McCartney, yes?
Yes.
And what about Arvin Kasparaitis? Does that name ring a bell?
Absolutely, and Bruce Milky
Okay. Arvin was a fellow ski instructor and a dear friend of mine.
taught my kids.
Oh, I love it. Arvin was born in a displaced persons camp in Germany, came to Vail with Brian. They had next to nothing, and Arvin got very sick and had to have a pig valve put in, went back to the hospital in Denver, and was near death. And your dad called, I suppose, the CEO of the Denver hospital and said, "My dear friend Arvin Kasparaitis is in the hospital, and I hope you'll take good care of him."
Hi, my name's Rich Rogel, and in 1993, we became the American parents of a Chinese violinist at, of course, the University of Michigan. And we had the same caretakers of our house as the Fords did. And he's now our son, but Gao Sheng was telling us how President Ford was a hero in China. And he said, would there be any way that he could possibly meet him? So we called over, and President Ford's assistant said, "Come on over for 5 minutes, but you cannot have more than 5 minutes because it's a world forum." And so we go over there, and President Ford starts talking to Gao Sheng and talking to him, and they're talking about what he had seen in China and how important it was. And finally, after about 25 minutes, his assistant came in and said, "There are 3 cabinet members in the driveway waiting for you to go to this forum. You're late." And he says, "This is much more important."
We've got a little bit of time
Beth,
left.
I'm sure I know Beth has many stories.
I don't think I have any stories I can tell. But I do remember how important Betty Ford was to me personally. I came to Vail dating Rod Slifer, and at the time I was working for President Jimmy Carter, who had just defeated President Ford. And I remember Rodney taking me to dinner at the Ford's house while I was still working in Washington. And the president was not as warm and adorable as he was later. And Betty immediately embraced me and made it very clear that people are just people, and politics is not really the basis of any relationship. And ever since that first meeting at dinner in their house, the Fords have been so important to all of us. My favorite thing when I walk the dog by the Gerald Ford Amphitheater is, and if you haven't noticed, please go and look. There's a photograph of the president and Betty Ford, and beneath it is engraved, "They brought the world to Vail." And that happened.
Okay, that is a great ender, Beth. Thank you. We've got just a minute or two, and so you've now heard from your community in the room tonight and had a chance to reflect as you've heard stories from the audience. I wonder if you could both offer some closing thoughts for us as we celebrate the legacy of your parents and as we think about the impact that they had on our little town. Not many towns in America can claim genuine fingerprints from a US president, and we are one such community. It's a true honor, and so I wonder if you could close us out.
Sure. So a couple things come to mind because it really maybe is a question of legacy. And Susan mentioned the Beaver Creek Chapel and how that came about. But you know, to me, my son was baptized in the chapel, and to me, it's a great symbol of what they did together because my grandfather, the president, and Mrs. Ford, I think in many ways, three amigos and some different ventures, that being one. And, you know, I think it's such a gift for the community that they step forward in the leadership of it to build it and make it happen, because think about the tens of thousands of people that have, you know, prayed there, that have celebrated there, that have enjoyed Beaver Creek, that have come to Beaver Creek because that was a destination to have a wedding or whatever it may be. And, you know, for them as the pioneers of Beaver Creek to have left that for all of us to enjoy and share, I think is just a remarkable thing and accomplishment.
Well, and the other part of it is my mother loved going to her AA meetings in the Beaver Creek Chapel. She loved it. She says that is the most cross of America. People came in ski boots and ski wear, and Jones in his cowboy hat and cowboy boots, and she just loved her AA meetings in Beaver Creek when she was here for the summer and also for the winter. And at Christmas time, they would bring cookies in, because that was usually one of the largest meetings, was always right around Christmas time. But I think it's a great example when you look at the fact that Len and me and all are still coming back. I know, and I've told my children to take my ashes and spread them on this mountain. I have some of the happiest memories in this village, in this whole valley, starting in Vail and going over to Beaver Creek. It's the best skiing. I had many laughs, many loves, many wonderful, happy times in this valley. And I really felt I had my parents' attention here. We weren't in Washington, and they could be parents, and they could be that kind of thing. Liberty, our golden retriever, bred to Bart. As we all know, Bart and Yetis down. We had golden retriever puppies that were bred here, thanks to John Purcell and Alfie Packer. And I mean, I could go on and on about all the people who have touched my life in this valley, and I love them all and I appreciate them all. And the fact that we're still coming back should tell you all you need to know.
We are grateful. Leonard Firestone and Susan Ford Bales.